Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's my evening, but I'm very happy to be connected with all of you. So this evening, it's a great opportunity for this group of panelists, speakers, including myself, to share and engage in discussion with all of you a bit about where we've been thinking and reflecting together for probably more than a year, I guess I would say now, about the concept of vulnerability in urban spaces, and especially as it relates to Cambodia and Phnom Penh specifically, um, and why a vulnerability approach to thinking about urbanization. So Cambodia is a country like many in Southeast Asia that is rapidly urbanizing. And while the majority of the country, the vast majority of the country is still rural, more attention is increasingly being paid to the urban context. And the question of how urban development is taking place, how it's impacting the urban residents of Cambodia are important questions to be asking. And importantly, a vulnerability approach is different than research into poverty or the conditions of poverty, and it brings something a little bit different, and that's something that we hope to share with you today, an approach that is dynamic and that is aimed at capturing change and possibility as well. And so what I'm going to share with you today, we can go to the next slide, is a bit of an overview. So my own research background is more focused on vulnerability as it relates to a context of displacement and migration. But I have also worked and lived in Cambodia previously, and so I'm very eager and interested to be reflecting on the applicability of a vulnerability approach and some of the questions that it raises when it comes to the context of Cambodia. So while there is a long, list of scholars and sets of research that has focused on poverty in Phnom Penh and elsewhere in Cambodia, what's missing is really a multi-leveled and a multi-scalar analysis when it comes to urban conditions. And that kind of multi-leveled, multi-scalar analysis can really help shed light on the kinds of risk that city residents would encounter in the face of new challenges or shocks or exacerbated challenges or shocks that are already present, whether those would be on the level of the social, the environmental, the political, and beyond. And so one of the important things about a vulnerability approach is that we are looking not only at the factors that render a population susceptible to risk, but also that which we also look at resilience, right? That which can constitute a resource to cope with or manage that risk, or that would enable population or community or even an individual household to maintain a level of stability in the face of that potential challenge or risk. So I think a helpful way of thinking about what vulnerability is essentially a framework in urban environments that can help us assess that risk and help us all as well assess and evaluate assets and resources that can be deployed to withstand, to manage a challenge. So it often looks at overlapping factors. It takes into consideration, so it's one of the important things that I want to emphasize about a vulnerability approach is that it emphasizes a multidisciplinary approach, right? So it involves considering economic factors. You can see here, I mean, if you look at the list of fragility factors and resilience factors, fragility being analogous to vulnerability, we can see that we would involve sort of the study of economics as well as an awareness of social level protections, an awareness of sort of a legal framework that's in place, the ecology of a space as well. It concerns planning and infrastructure as well, and historical analysis, and of course, a focus on an analysis of perception and how people understand their context, understand their set of opportunities and constraints. And so these are essential for a vulnerability approach in urban spaces. It has to be multidisciplinary, and that also, in addition to thinking of something that's dynamic, an approach that's dynamic, and an approach that brings together an analysis of both risk and resilience. The fact that it's so multidisciplinary is something that makes it unique in this context. So the other thing that I want to highlight with the time that I have is the importance of thinking about scale as well. So as I mentioned, vulnerability approach in an urban space is necessarily multi-scalar. And that means that we are thinking of, concretely, we are thinking of the risk of an individual household, right, to poverty and displacement. And importantly on this, I think I have the time to elaborate just a little bit. When we often think of poverty, we might use global metrics for evaluating poverty. And Cambodia has made amazing strides in the last decade plus in reducing poverty, but it often leaves out the category of the near poor. And a vulnerability approach is helpful because it enables us through an analysis to understand the risks or the possibilities of folks who are in that somewhat precarious position of near poor, of falling back into poverty, as well as understanding other challenges with being in the near poor category, and even for people who are in other classes in middle class life, what types of factors would exacerbate the possibility that they would encounter harm in the face of shocks including climate change or socio-political challenges that they encounter. So going back to the topic of scale, so it's important to think not only of the experience of individual households, but also thinking about community structures that are capable of providing aid and support to struggling members of the community, the ecological impacts on neighborhoods and cities, thinking about it as a system as well, where planning and zoning have an impact on what kinds of development can happen, as well as the broader development trajectory of the city itself. Where is the city going? Is there a broad plan for development? What is the contour, the landscape of development projects? And how is that impacting the kinds of opportunities or risks that people are experiencing? And then finally, we think about vulnerability as a connection between urban and rural dynamics as well. It's impossible to analyze one without the other. And we even extend, in order to understand vulnerability in the urban context, we recognize the importance of taking a global approach as well, and thinking about how connections with global supply chains, for example, international law, the sort of donor community are all part of the web of the complicated web of connections that, depending on changes and shifts, can have an impact. And of course, I mentioned before, climate change. And then, as we'll hear in subsequent presentations, the role of global financial markets as well. All of this bears an influence on urban life, and potentially could impact, could constitute risk, or there would be areas in which, as we can see by this list of resilience factors, residents can maintain a level of security and stability in the face of that risk. So I think I'm out of time, but I will pass it on to my next presenter, and I look forward to engaging more on these topics in the Q&A. Thanks.
So Good morning, everybody, and good evening for the one of you that are on a different time zone. And thank you so much for joining us despite a late hour. To all Cambodians as well that are joining. First of all, I would like to thank the Asia Foundation and the Australian Embassy DFAT for allowing this webinar to take place and for the support that they provide to CKS Urban Research Program. It's one that we appreciate very much, so thank you. Thank you, Adam, for as well laying out very nicely the ground. You mentioned poverty, you mentioned near poor, you mentioned the role of global economic systems. I think it's very important when we think about urban vulnerability to think macro as well, not to focus only on specific sectors, and to think of urban vulnerability that they operate in complex urban systems. So we will try to unpack a bit those different notions. The time is very short. But before I start, I might want to share with everybody that the concept of vulnerability is interesting because it really follows the Cambodia development path. Initially, when we think or when we speak about vulnerability, let's say in early 2000, we are very much focused on specific sectors. So you could speak about, vulnerability of the farmers in the agricultural sector. You could speak of vulnerability of ecosystems such as the Tonle Sap in front of, for example, intensive fishery, etc., etc. And so that was really early 2000. So, Cambodia starts to develop economically, socially. And there is a turning point in 2005, around 2005, 2006. And for the first time, and the International Development Agency, it was the World Bank, I think, if I remember well, that kind of coined the term vulnerability in a more holistic way. By holistic, what I mean by that is that instead of looking at different sectors, they look at the country as a whole. And it really came with the thinking that poverty reduction was, poverty was reduced quite significantly. So Cambodia was on the curve where on the 2015 target to halve poverty, it made significant progress. But what economists and International Development Agency could observe was, despite the fact that, income and asset is improving and GDP per capita is improving as well, there are a tranche of the population that is still very vulnerable to risk and shocks. And this trend, starting in 2005, kind of consolidate itself in 2013, 2014. So I remember to all the audience that we were maybe 2 or 3 years toward the end of the MDG monitoring and assessment, the Millennium Development Goals. And Cambodia was doing quite well in 2013 because the country reached about around 20% of poverty headcount, and that compared to more than 40% 10 to 15 years ago. So here again, the message was, okay, the country is really doing well. It has been able to harness the economic force in order to provide better livelihood opportunity for the poor, extreme poor and the poor. But we need to be mindful of the fact that if you look at the poverty line, which is about $2 US a day, there are a lot of people clustered right above that poverty line. And estimation were giving maybe, the figures varied between 30 to 50% of the population. So it's kind of a huge amount. There hasn't been any in-depth study conducted on that. It's again an estimation, but it gave the risk that Cambodia was facing and that it had to address. And it was important to point out over that because it was not just, okay, we have reduced poverty, now let's focus on something else. So that's kind of the background, and it's an important one to keep in mind, because when we now think about urban vulnerability, poverty and inequality are at the core of vulnerability measures, but not only. And as Adam was presenting or suggesting during his introduction, there are many other criteria that we need to think about, and we must not just narrow on specific classic intervention, so to speak. So maybe a bit more now about urban vulnerability. So this is not new. Urban intervention have maybe been developed more than 10 years ago. But what is very interesting is that it really picked up over the past 5 years. And one of the way or the indicators that can measure that is the number of agencies, international agencies and local NGOs that are focusing more on urban related issues now. We can see as well, that like strategic documents such as the NSDP, the National Strategic Development Plan of the Royal Government of Cambodia, have really mentioned at the core of their new strategy, urban development. It is an emerging issue that needs to be considered very well and with attention. And the United Nations as well have included within their, they call it the UNDAF, the United Nations Development and Assistance Framework, that criteria as well at the core of their country strategy. There are as well other agencies such as GIZ that are doing a very good job. So GIZ is well known because they have implemented the ID poor methodology, which has been a targeting mechanism to really identify where are the poor geographically, who are they, and help targeting assistance. And even GIZ is currently revising the ID poor methodology, which was mainly looking at rural areas and adapting it and rethinking it so that the urban characteristic can be taken into account. So when we talk about, I hear the signal already. I'm not even half my presentation. So when we think about economic characteristic of urban system, we need to think about the link between urban growth, social development, and vulnerability. The classic approach or the classic focus from development agencies and NGO are looking at infrastructure, or they are looking at people-related vulnerabilities such as urban poor. Those are kind of the classic intervention. And recently they are as well focusing on access to services, right? Such as water, government services, etc., etc. So, but what is clear, and there is a consensus that mitigating the negative impact of urban systems is important, and mitigating as well the impact of other systems such as the climate change risk and threats that are as well posing an issue, posing a risk not only in rural areas, we all know, but as well in urban area. Now, what is important is that we are still lacking a lot the understanding about the connection between the economic system and urban systems such as Phnom Penh, Siem Reap, or Sihanoukville. What is important is that beyond infrastructure and the effect that urbanization have on people, there are large market forces that are at play. Those market forces, they're mainly driven by economic sectors. So we look at construction, we look at garment, and there are positive forces, right? Because they provide an income to a fringe of the population that is often the low-income population that wouldn't have an income if construction and tourism and garment were not thriving. But now this thinking needs to be placed into the context of urbanization trends, and it needs to be think through in the sense that those sectors, for example, have attracted and have provided employment to not only pockets of vulnerable population residing in the city or peripheral areas, but they have as well attracted migrant workers, and one of my colleagues will talk more about that later on, within urban areas. But how this adaptation take place, to what extent the living conditions and the economic conditions that are related to urban life, and the revenue and the income and the conditions that those economic opportunities provide to those vulnerable, and this needs to be qualified, but to those vulnerable population segment, how does this play out? And there is an interesting, there is more research that is needed there. There is as well more research that is needed to understand as well the link between urban and rural. During a long time, development sector have kind of chosen it was either rural area or urban area, and urban area or urban related issues were a bit of the poor child. Oh, there is not so much support needed in urban area. There is a lot of capital. There is there is not so much actually vulnerability. So there is kind of a bias that says urban area equal not so much worry. The issues, poverty, inequality, lack of infrastructure is really placed on rural areas. But we can see over the past 5 years that in fact the two have to be considered together. We need to think about a spatial approach rather than making a choice between urban and rural. And this is where things really become interesting. So for example, one point related to urban population is to try to understand, when we talk about urban population, how many people are we talking about? So if we give an estimation of about 2 million in Phnom Penh, what would those 2 million encompass? Would it be only resident? Would it be a transient population, etc., etc.? And as of today, we still do not have a very clear understanding of that. And part of this global population, those stock and flows, if you allow me the expression, how many of them are falling under the vulnerable category? Because those are not certainly, I mean, the ones that are living in precarious condition and informal housing are certainly part of those, but there may be others and many others. And it will be really interesting to ask ourselves the question, what is the size of the issue and what is the nature of that issue beyond infrastructure and beyond classic informal settlement support that is provided currently? And it is good. I'm not saying that it's not useful, but it is good and we need to go beyond. As well, what is important, and maybe this is my last point, is really to think about the economic transformation that Cambodia is undertaking today and the central role that urban spaces are playing within that transformation. So when we think about urbanization, we often, maybe we assume that urbanization benefits everybody, but in the reality, it benefits middle income up, right? Middle income and people that have more capital. But the thing is that benefit of urbanization, whether it is comfortable housing, education, access to basic services, quality of life, etc., etc., come with a hefty price tag. There is a cost for that. So how do low income cope with that situation? What is it when we talk about access? And there are many different dimensions when we talk about access. We have done a recent study on urban mobility. So, how does mobility plays out for the different segment of the population? So this urban development force obeys more or less to an economic model that is liberal and that is market oriented. And nothing good, nothing bad with it. And I mean, it's pretty positive because this model have kind of fueled the growth, the economic growth that Cambodia has seen over the last years, have enabled the country to move to low middle income country status. But now, maybe this is the right time in COVID time, and where we see an economic slowdown, and when the economy slows down, it affects many livelihoods across the board. So how can we rethink the model? How can we think beyond GDP. Maybe it is time. So there is kind of a, I cannot say a consensus, but there is a growing voices that are saying, you know, GDP is not a sufficient measure. GDP is a very imperfect measure, and we can do a whole a webinar on that. But how can we consider again beyond infrastructure and beyond, you know, pocket of poverty and pocket of inequalities? How do we think about the bigger model, the larger model, the fact that because Cambodia is following the development path of its neighbors, of more developed countries, it has intense need for energy supply, right? Whether those are fossil fuel, and so one of the question is, how is Cambodia going to be able to reconcile those intensive energy needs that we know are, for example, you know, generating a lot of particles and therefore contributing to urban pollution, air pollution, etc., etc. While, you know, not slowing down and trying to maintain economic growth. What will be the formula? How are we going as well to mitigate and think and analyze better phenomena such as urban heat islands, you know, so elevated temperature in specific area within a city. And we have actually a CKS senior fellow, Se Boon Leng, that is actually conducting his research on that topic. So it's a very promising one. And of course, at a bigger level, there is really this commitment to climate change, and Cambodia is one of the signatory, and you know, has committed to the Paris Agreement. So how does the country is going to be able to respond to the NDC agenda that is in fact in a large part an urban agenda, because economic growth really take place and materialize around city. So those are a question that we ask. We cannot answer them yet, and there is a long way ahead, but those are to us important questions. So in light of COVID-19 crisis, COVID-19 is really a terrible crisis. It has affected a lot of people in Cambodia and in other countries. But as any crisis, it accentuates vulnerabilities. The recovery has to be an economic recovery. We need to think about that, certainly, but it must not be only economic. It has to be social. There are as well work related to, you know, social protection policies, social safety nets that are at the core of the development agenda and led by many government agencies together with development partners. This is really an interesting ground moving forward. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope the sound system work well. So I would like to take on from Bong Natharon to present the next topic, which is about the relationship between migration and urban vulnerability. This topic, I think, fit well within the broader framework and also the context as just laid out by the previous speaker, both Adam and Bong Natharon. Just a note, my presentation is based on a survey, a report published by the World Food Programme in 2019. The survey actually was based on a data collection of around 2,500 households in 160 villages in all the 24 provinces in Cambodia in late 2016 and early 2017. So the data that I'm going to present today is 3 years old, but whatever the trend that we were that were found in 2017, I would expect it would have been only growing in the last 3 years. I personally was involved in the data analysis, and I had confirmed with the World Food Programme that I could use the data for this webinar presentation. So let's go to the key point of this topic. In my understanding, I think migration is both a key contextual factors for understanding urban vulnerability, but at the same time, I would say migration, especially the rural to urban migration, is a direct and also significant variable shaping the nature of urban vulnerability in Cambodia. The reason why I think rural to urban migration is a key factor is due to three main reasons. The first one, as the data show, over time in the last decade or so, the movement of rural to urban migration has increased sharply. As you can see in this slide, as you can see, on average, throughout the country, the percentage of households who have at least one of their family member migrating out is around 35%. Of course, it's a bit higher in the plain areas and the lowest in the plateau area. We will discuss more why that is the case. So that is number one. Number two, as also shown in the other diagram in the shown slide, now the share of the rural to urban migration is the highest at almost 60% of all the total migration by destination. Just for your note, this 60% of rural to urban migration is actually almost a flip side contrast to about 5 years ago. Around 5 years ago, before this data collection was done, it was rural to rural migration that accounted for about 60%. So 5 years later, it is the rural to urban migration that took the largest part. This is one important point. The second important point why migration is a key factor to urban vulnerability is the fact that because of this large rural to urban migration, but also because of the, I would say, two-way dependency, especially in terms of a livelihood through remittance, it makes the urban vulnerability, migration, and rural vulnerability very closely connected. That is point number two. And the last one, which make migration a key factor to be considered here, is that migration, especially to big city like Phnom Penh, becomes the key source of population growth in urban areas. And therefore creating additional pressure for urban management and development. So those are the key important points I would like to make, which we can further discuss in the Q&A session. Just a key note on the nature of rural urban migration in the last decades. The data show that about 80% of migrants from rural to urban area are young people, and by that we use the definition of the age from 17 to 35. So 80% of them are considered young people, and both men and women migrate almost equally. So that is one characteristic. As to the cause of migration, the data show that usually there is a push factor, i.e. the poverty, indebtedness, the natural disaster and so on, that push certain people to migrate out to look for a job. However, after a while, it is the pull factor that play an important role, meaning that people do not get pushed by the challenges back home, but it just they are more pulled by the prospect of having a better jobs in the city area. So that is an important factor, the push and pull. One of the key, at least in my opinion, challenges or point of concern about rural to urban migration in Cambodia is the fact that among the many young people who migrate out, they are either considered as no skill or low skill. And this dictates the kind of job that they end up working in the city. We usually fall in the garment sector, in the tourism-related sector, and also other mainly physical kind of labor of work. So the low skill is closely associated in a not so good way with migration. That said, because of the good economic growth in the urban area in the last decade, despite the low level of skill, the data show that migrants managed to send a lot of remittance support back home. It can be good, it can be bad. So that is another important point. Actually, the World Food Program survey did another study as well, which looked at the vulnerability issue specifically in Phnom Penh. And what it shows is that the population growth in Phnom Penh city, especially in the outer zone, has been driven mainly by migrant workers who end up working in a low-skill sector, as I just mentioned, namely garment, tourism-related sector, which then link to my next point, which Bong Natron also mentioned. Now we have this COVID crisis. There has been study that already show the significant impact of the COVID crisis on this important sector, especially garment and tourism related sector. So when these two main sectors are badly hit, we can only expect that it will has a direct impact on these migrant workers, which make them vulnerable while living in the city if they continue to do that. But obviously, this will also be translated into the vulnerability for their family back home who have to some extent depended on the remittance that's sent back to them. I would like to end my presentation here. I'm looking forward to more discussion during the Q&A session, but just for the next part, I would like to invite Bong Tritun, who is the Senior Research Fellow at CKS, to continue his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kham Chuen, for your presentation and the introductions. My part, I wish to share with the audience about how the concept of zonings and urban plans has affected the livelihood and informal settlements in the city. As you may know, Phnom Penh has been growing rapidly recent decades, and this is the potential of expanding the cities more rapidly to different area of the cities. Yes. So what are the key factors that influence this driving force? First, we look at these, the current policy and the discourse around the concept of zonings. If we can examine, like many scholars who conduct a study in the cities did not pay much attention on how is the concept of zonings, which is one of the most foundation of the urban plannings and spatial plans, has been formed into the fundamental in exclusions and including some people in a different social class and also ethnic classifications in the cities. The history of urban zoning has been conducted since the colonial time, like back to 19th centuries, and this has been become more and more increasingly formalized in shaping the urban planners and the policy makers in extending the zonings. And when we are look at the concept of zonings, and of course there is always the intentional zonings, whether the zoning has been in the public interest or whether it's in favor of a small group of those who have a strong capital. In the public intention, the zoning has more intention to serve the public interest, but when we examine in realities, this become more and more a strategy to exclude majority of the public, those who have a very less assets and less secure tenures, and this has become one of the problems that's facing with the urban area, and also the vulnerabilities of the people who are living in the cities. So if we look at the reality of the urban poor I think mostly these people are very much living around area very close with the urbans that's less secure 10 years, and mostly in the urban lake in the city. Recently, if we look at the strategy of the urban lake, like it around 26 urban lake and cover around 100 square meters, and about 40% of this lake already filled up, and a lot of urban poor are associated with this area. And if we look at this, the key area of social livelihood, like the poor play a very big role in producing food production in the cities, and also the labor force to the city. If we look at this, like more those people who come to the cities, only these poor people who can have a more manual labor works to serve the city when the city become more grown. And yeah, it is somehow like with the topic of climate change, with the expansion of urbanizations, the poor has been more and more vulnerable to the urban expansions, and even they have been a key force of labor to serve the city. And the other point that I wish to share is like when we are talking about the urban vulnerabilities, we tend to forget about the role of the poor and the role of the institution and the key actors that are involved with the policy making. And of course, when we are talking about urban vulnerabilities, we tend to focus on the resilience, how to overcome the urban resilience. The first, when we look at the policy framework, look at the resilience, we can see three disconnected concepts. Like the first, we need to have a common understanding of what is resilient, like ability to bounce back and recover. But when you face with these urban expansions, COVID and increase intensified flooding, and we don't know how these poor people who become one of the big labor force to the city can recover in terms of economics, in terms of access to livelihood and job security. And also there is a fragmentation between the state institutions who are dealing with the urban climate change and climate resilience. They may not have the common understanding and technical coordination, and this tend to provide different priority of the urban resilient intervention. Mostly infrastructures and high-rise buildings is more oriented, while the poor become less marginalized. And also a thing like the role of the civil society, who can play a big role in conducting the change and balance, and also the trend to create a co-learning between the expert in zones and expansion. And this is the tension that we can see the encountering between the scientific knowledge and local knowledge that are generated by the local people should be incorporated to overcome the fragmentation of urban resilience intervention. So like when we are talking about how to promote urban resilience to overcome the urban vulnerabilities, mostly from the people perspective. One thing we need to examine is to see how autonomous are the state institution when dealing with the urban vulnerabilities and resilience. And secondly, we can examine the role of civil society. Whether the role of civil society, the expert-oriented, trust or not among the local people and the policymaker. And also, it is very important to examine how the people respond when you are facing the urban vulnerability in floods and disaster. In particular, local knowledge and the expert knowledge, how this can be incorporated into the urban plannings. So my conclusion is to overcome urban resilience, I think the first thing we need to understand the role of the state and whether the state is more autonomous entities that are not in favor for the capitals, and the role of a trust civil society in coordinating and helping bridging the gap of knowledge, and also the role of people participations in making a better place and share the urban vision together. Yes.
Thank you, Ujai. I should present to you now a specific project which is currently taking place in south of Phnom Penh, especially in Bencheng Lake. The name of this project is ING City. So in this part of the city, the natural landscape is disappearing in favor of vertical urban landscape. So currently the creation of Unsen Boulevard in the middle of Bencheng Lake is initiate this landscape transformation, as you can see on the picture. The choices related to the development of the city do not involve the restoration of the building or the densification of the historic can, but rather the extension of the city into previously rural or undeveloped spaces. So this urban development strategy involves the appropriation of natural resources in order to transform the surrounding waters and land into form of property value. So I will try to explain how the nature of the change puts the inhabitants of this space at risk, and also as implication for how the environment will respond to climate change. So due to its considerable water area, about 2,800 hectares, the Bencheng Lake naturally fulfills two essential functions. On one hand, the bank cleans up the wastewater from the city of Phnom Penh that passes through it before being discharged in the Mekong River. And on the other hand, the essential role of the lake lies in its important capacity to retain water during the rainy season and for several weeks, if necessary. These 2,008 hectares in time of flood accumulate a considerable water. The Bencheng Lake performs vital hydraulic function to enable the capital to be partially protected from flooding. Next. Since the implementation of ING projects, this balance tends to be broken. The gradual disappearance of Bencheng Lake means that the natural function of wastewater management and the protection of the city against flooding will disappear in favor of purely technical and very expensive solutions. Next. Furthermore, aquifer use and agriculture environments that are disappearing as the urban space advances, such as Bencheng Lake is not unoccupied. Many villagers are settled there in addition to the fauna and the flora, which offer an exceptional biodiversity. And as you can see in the picture, agricultural practices are still very common. However, land transactions associated with sprawling development have tended to the result in form of displacement, pushing once settled population out of the city. In many cases, this project emerged out of the ground in record time, and the associated frenzy resettlement process fueled the forced eviction of population and the injustice of dispossession. In addition to the social consequences of urban development, the transformation of Bencheng Lake threatened the delicate environmental balance of natural space, its biodiversity, and the way of people have interacted with the lake and plants. In order to fill lakes and obtain sand to make concrete for construction sites, developers extract the sand of the Mekong and Bassac River. This extraction have a worrying impact on the environment, and especially on the riverbank, which are sliding into the river, putting many at risk of losing their riverside homes and have a dramatic consequences on the ecosystem. Sand playing a vital role in the ecosystem, and it's becoming a jeopardized resources, which can affect biodiversity, erosion, but also increase salinization. Next. Furthermore, environmental changing that some external actors, like developers, make to space jeopardize the livelihood essential to the survival of inhabitants. The degradation of the immediate natural environment of the poorest population, who still depend heavily on natural resources, appear to produce or exacerbate environmental and social inequalities. Moreover, community will not have the same capacity to adapt according to their gender, age, and social position. This raises the point that environmental vulnerability has an eminently social character, since human activity are notably the result of social processes. To conclude, the unbridled development that characterizes the Cambodian capital over the last 20 years has produced a significant environmental and social disorder. It also signifies an encroachment on the common resources like water that contribute to the public well-being. The story of urban development and environmental destruction in Benchengik is one manifestation of Cambodia's current urban development trajectory, which renders its population increasingly vulnerable to the danger of climate change. I will now turn the floor over to Gabriel Fauveau, who will comment the link between real estate development and economy vulnerability. Thank you.
Thanks, Dolores, for your contribution. Thanks to the CKS, Annika, Samedi, and all of those who worked so hard for this. So we will keep on the topic of the relation between real estate development and urban vulnerabilities. And in my presentation, I will insist there is plenty of angles about this relation, but I will insist on a recent development of real estate markets, which will, for sure, if it stays as it is now, increase economic vulnerabilities in the future. So, as you all know, Phnom Penh real estate markets are experiencing a real estate boom since at least the 2000s. And this implies the production of bore in peri-urban areas. In this map, you can see all of the construction permits that have been authorized by the municipality of Phnom Penh between 2010 and 2017. I have to thank Dolores because she helped me a lot on this work. In blue, you have some apartments. In yellow, orange, sorry, you have the bores, and in red you have, as you can guess, I'm sure, the condominiums project. So this boom, the boom of the real estate markets changed since 2010 when a series of laws and a new regulatory framework has been voted, which notably allows foreigners to buy flats in Cambodia above the first floor. So condominiums have become a huge generic form of real estate development in Phnom Penh. So first, due to this change in the regulations. Second, because Phnom Penh continue to attract a lot of foreign investors, mostly from the regions. And by foreign investors, I mean both developers, pension funds, investors, like institutional investors, like private companies, but also individual households from Korea, China, Japan, who wanted to have a share of this really speculative market. And a third factor, which is not mentioned so often, is what we can call the financialization of the Cambodian economy. By financialization, I mean the growing influence of financial markets, but also financial rationals and practice into the development of the economies in general, but also in the real estate economies. So this financialization is generated by a greater access to mortgage loan, to bank services, and of course by the growing presence of financial actors, mainly from Asia, again, into the Cambodian economy, but mostly into real estate market. So as a consequence, Phnom Penh real estate market have been growingly and very fastly since 2010 integrated into the global economy. This accentuated its dependence to foreign investments. Local, like Phnom Penh real estate markets now need foreign investment to work. And second, real estate markets are much more exposed, and this is related to the former reason, to economic downturn, to the burst of speculative bubbles, and to any events that can happen to the global economy, like COVID-19, for instance, which will have a huge impact, supposedly, on local real estate market. This was totally different, for instance, in the 2008 crisis. During the 2008 crisis, local real estate market in Phnom Penh did not move that much because most of the buyers and the investors were Cambodians, and they were able just to wait that the market and the economic restart. But now this is a totally different situation. Why this is a key issue for the whole Cambodian economy? First, because a huge number of jobs and economic sectors depend on real estate activity. When you are talking about real estate markets, you're also talking about tourism, construction, banking, craft workers, and a huge, a vast spectrum of service activities that are working for real estate activities. Second, because Cambodian household wealth is more and more related to home ownership and to real estate speculation. You buy a house, you buy several houses to generate money from it. And with this money, you will develop your own activity. You will give it to your children for them to follow university studies, etc., etc. Without this, you will cut a lot of money and a lot of perspective of enrichment to a lot of Cambodian households. So if there is, with this very speculative market, the risk is that you have a general crisis of the economy, a vicious circle, and that's a large part of the Cambodian population is pushed into poverty. So to finish, I will have my last slide. So what can be done about this? Many things, but I've listed here few priorities or few things that have to be done in a near future to control this very speculative market and to avoid the very bad effect of the burst of a speculative bubble. First, we need some numbers and we need some data. It's very, very, very difficult to document the evolution of real estate market in Cambodia because neither the government, neither private actors are actually publishing some data. It's even difficult to know who owns what in which part of the city. So we need some data as soon as possible. Second, we have to limit the growth of land and housing prices because it's exclude a lot of people, more and more people from the market by controlling the selling prices. First, we have to prevent the most speculative practices by limiting, for instance, the rapidity of individual real estate transaction or the flipping strategies, and we could name a lot of speculative practices that we can easily limit in Cambodia. We have forced to prevent the control of real estate assets, especially land by foreign companies in joint venture or nominee structure. It's very easy for foreign actors to actually control land and real estate assets in Cambodia. There is multiple strategy to circumvent the current legal framework, and we have to enforce and develop this legal framework to give a better control to the local governments, but also to Cambodians, to their real estate and land commodities. 5, we have to limit over-indebtedness of Cambodian household by better controlling access to mortgage, prohibiting predatory lending practices by banks, and also by the numerous small banks and financial institutions that actually are multiplying in Cambodia. 6, we have to support the production of low-cost housing in all parts of the city. And 7, we also have to better regulate and oversight the working condition in the construction industry and its related profession. It's important to remember that between 1,000 and 1,500 workers are dying every year in the construction sector, and that forced labor, child labor, and women exploitation are common practices in the construction industry. Thanks. And now I think I give back the mics to Adam.
Thank you, Gabriel. So we can see from these wonderful presentations that we've heard just now, an approach to looking at an urban system that centers the question of both risk as well as resilience. We can see from the last slide that Gabriel showed multiple recommendations to promote or build up resilience in the face of likely or possible challenges and sources of harm. We can see the relevance of the susceptibility to global financial shifts in the markets. For example, when in the era of intense global connectivity, those types of shifts can have an impact on the individual household as well as an entire sector and many hundreds of thousands of people. We can see as well the link between the kind of mode of urban development, the way in which urban development is taking place, and the impact that that has on the environment, the local ecology in terms of Bong Chungag, and the communities living there. And then, of course, we can see in a related fashion the way that zoning and planning policies, including the royal decree from 2006, that shifted the use of land, including lakes and wetlands, to render it possible for development, how all of that has this impact that changes the kinds of possibilities and limitations and opportunities that urban residents experience. And we can see as well from Kim Chun's presentation, the link between rural and urban change, that they are inextricably linked, and that an experience in the rural environment has an impact on the urban and vice versa as well. And ultimately, you know, the presentations that we've heard today, really reinforce some of what Natarun was saying as well, which is that in a sense, economic growth doesn't necessarily translate to stability for the population. And that's why, you know, we've titled our collection of essays Limits to Growth. I've borrowed, without proper citation here, the image of the Weitai harbor, I think it is, development that does not exist yet, but in reference to the kind of imaginary of development of urban space in Cambodia, and that while we may be attracted to, or many may be attracted to sort of images like this that project an idea of what the urban space may look like in the future, it remains important to consider how such changes will impact the entire population and present new risks in the face of new kinds of shocks to the system, whether that's related to the global economy or a pandemic. So I think I better end there and pass it over to our moderators to help facilitate a great discussion. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you so very much to all of our panelists for their great conversation today. So we'll turn now to a few minutes of Q&A. So for this section, you're welcome to chat any of your questions into the chat box. Just make sure that you send them to everyone so that everyone can see your questions. You are also welcome to use the hand raise function in Zoom on the participant list, and I can also call on you directly and unmute you for that. And so now I will turn to one of the first questions we had asked in the chat box from Sochia Niem on aspects of community vulnerability, especially in this era of COVID-19. Adam kicked us off talking about individual household vulnerability and community vulnerability. So if you could speak about how some of those dynamics are being exposed right now in the COVID era, and maybe what we can take away about how to bolster urban community vulnerability in this time. And I'm open this up to any of the speakers. If you could keep your remarks fairly short so that we can get to as many questions as possible, that would be great. Tarun, perhaps as the economist, perhaps I'll turn to you on this point.
Thank you, Annika, for putting me on the spot. So there were many components on the question. Do you want me to focus on one particular element? Could you maybe nudge me toward, one specific dimension of the question? And
sure, perhaps focus on sort of single sector economies, as we see in a lot of cities in Cambodia, and how aspects of community vulnerability, how we can bolster community vulnerability given that we have sort of these single sector industries like tourism, like construction, that have been severely impacted by COVID-19.
So, okay. So, so maybe the question is really, if I may, to what extent different sectors, different economic sectors can really provide better opportunities, livelihood opportunities to, vulnerable households, vulnerable communities, vulnerable migrants, right? Is that correct? Kind of, okay. So we can see here, and I will take a point that was very well presented by Gabriel, related to the maybe construction sector. And what he was highlighting is that construction sector is a booming one, and therefore, has created many jobs. I don't have the figures in mind, but we can find them. But the question is not necessarily about, the number of jobs created and the level of income, but more the labor condition, right? That's one element. The second element is related to the kind of opportunities it provides. So to what extent, for example, revenue generated by informal, most of the work in construction sector is still informal. So what are the labor condition and level of income generated by informal construction sector enables beneficiaries of that income to do? Are they kind of surviving? Can they save? Can they invest? Can they improve really their livelihood? That's a question. And maybe a short point as well related to the garment sector that has been impacted as well by COVID. We can see that so in each economic sector, there is a bit of a political economy that is at play, and relationship between capital owners, capital providers, and workers, whether they are formal or informal, right? So if we take the lessons learned from all the assistance that have been given to the garment sector through the Better Factory Cambodia program, supported by the ILO, we can see that there needs to be support to create an environment where there is kind of a more level playing field, where workers can benefit from better condition. It's not going to happen if we just let the market do. Yeah, there needs to be an additional force that come and balance that. So I leave it open, but so it has happened in the garment sector. It may happen in the construction sector. There are as well already players that are, from international construction company that are already trying to influence the regulation and to set up proper, labor practice and everything. So it's not that it's not like there are not progress. There are progress, but as Gabriel was pointing, there's still a lot of progress to be made. And then I will end with this point. It boils down as well to the social responsibility of the investors. So to what extent, they come here with the vision of maximizing the capital and the return of capital versus really balancing, the more long-term income opportunities for a low-income population segment. To what extent as well, they are interested in training. There are several of the panelists have mentioned, the fact that there is a vulnerability embedded within the low skill of, for example, those migrant population, right? That comes and kind of discover the urban world and those economic sectors. So what can be done for them that is not being done today? And that would be even more important that, again, we are at a time of crisis. So everything is quite exposed now, and their level of vulnerability certainly is as well. So there needs to be this reflection taking place. Thank you. I'm not sure if I have answered the question or tried to answer it.
No, it's great and important to make the link between jobs and greater livelihood and community resilience and vulnerabilities. So that was very helpful. So I'll turn next on a topic that we've received in a couple questions on civic engagement and inclusion of local populations. So how can we as researchers, as policymakers, as practitioners, better involve local vulnerable populations in our program design, in our learning processes, and in broader processes of urban growth and urban development? So for this, perhaps I'll turn to Tree first, and then maybe we can go to Dolores, and then hear from any other panelists who'd like to jump in.
Okay, thank you, Annika. Yes, it's very interesting to look at these people engagements. Of course, when we are talking about people engagement and allowing them to participate in their own plannings, these group of people have the ability to make a better place where they live. They are not really a person who creates a mess in the place that they are living. So one thing is to create it like to clarify the perception of the policy planners, the urban planners who often oversee the urban poor as a problem, dirties in the city. Yes, so when we are generating the civil engagements, of course, there's also a compromising knowledge gap between the scientific and the local knowledge. They both can learn from each other, and so the urban poor, the civil society, the local resident also have the ability to share the urban visions of what type of livelihood, what type of activity that they can contribute to the sustainability of the city and the livable cities. Yeah, that's one part of my my observation on this one. Yeah.
Any other of our panelists want to jump in on this question?
You want me to answer to the question about the SEN?
If you had any thoughts on the question on civic engagement and including local populations in planning and development processes.
Yeah, the point is currently all urban development, most of all, are taking place without consultancy. And the point is maybe we can find solution to try to involve this population and maybe try to develop the city with them, not expert them. So the fact is today it's really a vertical urban planning, which is currently happening in Phnom Penh particularly. So maybe we have to see more horizontal one.
I'll turn next to Sat Kanyara, who's actually raised their hand. So we'll unmute you now and you can ask your question. You should see now an unmute button. There you go.
Hi. Hi. Sorry. So my name is Yara, and I would like to have a question to Bong Nat Harun. Yeah, so related to urban migrations. So I look at the slide presentation. There are a fast major like changing the figure from the last 5 years, and I see the new trend now. But do you have an idea that what will be the trend for the next 5 years? Will it be migrated more from rural to the urban, or will it shift from rural to rural, or from within one country to another? And do you have, second, it's, do you have any information how many cities in Cambodia are very much popular for migrants migrate into that city? Thank you.
Great, thanks for a great question. And for this one, I might actually turn to Kim Chun. I think he had some of those slides and has dug most deeply into the data.
Hi, thanks for the question. So on your question about the possible trend in the next 5 years, of course, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty generated by the COVID-19 crisis. So I think everyone is struggling what might happen next. But I would say that if I were to make one speculation, I would go into the driving force behind the rural to urban migration that happened in the last 5 years. And as I mentioned, the pull factor, which is the job, the prospect, is a key factor. And now after the COVID-19, we have to measure what is the impact of that crisis on the job prospect. And if it is decreasing, we can say that the pull factor has become less a factor. So we can say, I mean, just following the symbological reasoning, maybe I would say we start to see people moving back from the urban back to the rural area. That is one possibility. But that said, it's still a very uncertain situation, because I just want to link this discussion to another important, almost a conceptual point, because so far we have been discussing mainly about vulnerability, but I think the other side of the coin is also important, which is the resilience. So if we were to,
I think Kim Chun is breaking up and
back
having a
home
little
for a brief period and then come back again. And why is that? And the data seem to raise some concern about the economic hardship of those affected. And yet so far things seem to be not that serious. So is it just a case of safe landing in a time of crisis? So I mean, it's just that we don't really, at least to me, we don't really understand how people react to all this crisis. And that is point number one. I think relating to this one, what I think we need to understand more is the nature of connectedness among the key different sectors in the economy. So we are talking about real estate, and then linked to microfinance, and then linked to migration, and then links to all these other sectors. But how are all these connections related? And because I don't think that, for instance, if you want to understand real estate sector in the next 5 years, I don't think that whatever happened in the last 5 years can be used as a good basis for such a projection, because we are dealing quite a different situation now at the fundamental basis. So my answer to you in summary is that I really don't know. Is that we just need to appreciate the level of uncertainty we are facing with. Thank you.
Maybe Annika, if I have time, I'm happy as well to answer, to add and to complement Kim Chun, very clear answer. In terms of trend, I think it's interesting because again, Cambodia is following the path of neighboring countries that are more advanced in terms of their economic development. And we can see that the trend is that the concentration of urban density, yeah, and very likely in a time horizon of 5 years, Cambodia will see that happening. And some of the push factors that brings, and I'm not going to repeat Kim Chun example, are supporting this trend and increasing number of people that will live in cities, or very likely, if we talk about low-income population, around cities, because you know the gentrification factor will occur in Siem Reap, Kampong Som, Phnom Penh, etc., etc., and therefore they will be living in the periphery. So one of the driver is as well a very classic transformation of diminishing labor force in agriculture sector, increasing mechanization and industrialization, and therefore less requirements in the agriculture sector, which is one of the main employer in rural area. And this combined as well with more extreme weather events and unpredictability of season as well, that makes the coping strategies for rural farmers more difficult. And then you have as well demographic factors that explain it. So we all know as well, Cambodia mainly a young population, and therefore we see the transformation in terms of age structure, whereas in rural area remains more older people, and the younger people, they look for job, but they look for opportunities, right? They see the future where economic opportunities are, and therefore we talk about as well cities as engine of growth. And engine of growth, the only way to kind of balance that would be for the private sector working together with the government and implementing what we call local economic development approach, or a rural development strategy, where we think about the connection, for example, of, so this is really at the center of the discussion with COVID-19, the linkages in terms of value chain between rural and urban area, because the two connects, right? You need supply of vegetable and fruits to feed the tourism industry, or to feed, the hospitality industry in Phnom Penh, in Siem Reap. So there has been already a lot of intervention and research done on this, but what can we do differently to attract and retain the younger population in rural areas? There are investments that are needed, because if we keep status quo, migration is going to increase inevitably in urban areas.
Great, thanks so much. So I know we have a lot more questions and a lot more conversation to be had, but we are quickly coming up on the end of our time. And out of respect for all of our engaged participants and our panelists, some of whom are up very late across the world to participate today, we will wrap up shortly. But thank you all so much for being here. Thank you very much to the Asia Foundation and to the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for making this event possible. We encourage all of you to stay involved and stay engaged. You received a draft of a collection of essays from our panelists before this event, which they will be finalizing in the weeks to come. So we hope to be able to share that with you soon. And you will also see right now a post-event survey pop up on your screen. So we'd really appreciate your feedback on today's event. So now I'll just turn to my colleague Samadi for any last closing announcements.
Thank you, Annika, and thank you, everyone. So taking this opportunity, I'm pleased to pre-inform you that CKS is organizing another digital presentation on consequences on national variation in women health programming, which will be presented by our US fellows, who is also the PhD student in sociology from the University of Virginia on 1st December from 9 to 10:30 a.m. local time again. So for detailed information of the event, you will find out in our announcement, which will release soon. But to stay up to date with CKS program and even, please subscribe to our website or follow us on the social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And again, thank you so much for the very fruitful discussion and very active participation for the events today. And I hope that to have all of you again for the coming event of us again. And have a very nice day. And do not forget to fill the survey that for us on the screen. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.